We're at one of the most historically significant locations in the city of Flagstaff. This is a Flagstaff monument with a flagpole that commemorates the naming of Flagstaff. In 1876, our country's centennial year, there was a group of people traveling through here on their way to California. And of course, they would stop anywhere that they could find water. Water was obviously very scarce along the way. And where we're standing today is the site of Antelope Spring, and you can see the pond further down here formed by the spring. So this was a natural campsite for the pioneers heading west. And so they were camped here on July 4th, 1876. And in their baggage, they had a flag, and they stripped the limbs off of a ponderosa pine tree, ran up the flag, and had a 4th of July celebration. And so the town that came quite a few years later adopted the name Flagstaff, and that's what this monument commemorates. My grandfather and 4 of his brothers were grocers in Cincinnati, Ohio in the 1800s. And one evening, a guy came in the store who had just come back from here, and he told them great tales about this wonderful country, how there was pasture land for cattle all over the place and lots of opportunity to get rich. So my grandfather and his brothers thought that sounded pretty good, and they hopped on the train and came west. And their desire was to be ranchers, cattlemen. And so they came scouting west looking for a place to acquire a cattle ranch. And they rolled into Flagstaff on the railroad in April of 1886, just after a big fire had burned down virtually all of the town. So they get off the railroad and survey the smoldering ash, and they think, boy, I don't know if we came to the right place. But they did decide to stay. They bought a herd of 1,500 cattle, and they invented their own brand for their new herd, the C.O. Bar brand, after their old hometown of Cincinnati, Ohio. So they settled here, established a cattle ranch, which over the years grew to be a very, very large ranch, one of the biggest in the West. But also, you know, it was a time for entrepreneurs. The opportunity was there. They established a mercantile store, not unlike their old store in Cincinnati, and they diversified into a whole lot of different businesses. So I'm in the 3rd generation. My grandfather was one of the original people who started it. And besides the cattle ranch, some of their mercantile operations still survive. And the reason that I was interested in doing this book is Flagstaff is relatively a new town. It's barely more than 100 years old. And lots of the population growth, at least in the past 40 years, are people who have come from other places, in other words, not native born. So they don't really know what came before them here, and they don't really realize the richness of the architecture and the people and the history. And so I kind of wanted to, if you will, codify that in one place in one book so people could really understand not only where we are today, but certainly where we have come from. We are in the historic Coconino County Courthouse, a wonderful building from 1894, built soon after Coconino County was split away from Yavapai County. Yavapai County has Prescott as its county seat, and with the new county, Coconino County, Flagstaff was chosen as the county seat. And they set about immediately building this Richardsonian Romanesque style courthouse out of locally quarried Moenkopi sandstone, which was quarried about 2 miles up the road here and hauled down here and built. Now, the courthouse was added to because the community was growing quite rapidly. About 30 years after it was first built, a whole new section was put on, in 1925, matched perfectly with the cut sandstone and all the detailing. But then along came the 1950s, and people decided that buildings, particularly public buildings, ought to have a more, shall we say, a modern look to them. And so they covered the front entrance, the beautiful front entrance, and the stairs leading into the courthouse with big glass and aluminum enclosure, and really ruined the whole effect of the beautiful courthouse. So then along about 1995 or so, the county allocated money and decided they wanted to do a big restoration. They took off all of those non-historic additions and brought it back to the beautiful structure that you see today. So I want to talk a little bit about the founding of Flagstaff. Flagstaff geographically lies along the 35th parallel of latitude. That parallel from Albuquerque, New Mexico to Los Angeles was chosen for the route of the second transcontinental railroad, and that began building west from Albuquerque in 1880. It reached Flagstaff in 1882 and is really the reason why Flagstaff is here. Once a railroad depot was established and transportation was possible all along the railroad line, that was, in those days, that was the Atlantic and Pacific Railroad, and that is the reason for the founding of the town in 1882. Soon after that, a Chicago industrialist, Edward Ayer, realized the potential in this huge ponderosa pine forest all around Flagstaff for timber production. And so he brought a lumber mill out, established it right after the railroad got here, and began cutting trees and milling lumber. And that went on for a very long time as the city's principal interest. By far and away the city's major employer. And I think by 1912 or so, they were producing millions of board feet of ponderosa pine lumber to be shipped all over the country. And so that really was the founding industry along with the railroad. The other thing the railroad provided an opportunity for was the shipment of livestock to market, either in Kansas or in Texas or of course out in California. My family, as I think I had mentioned at some point before, was in that livestock business fairly early on. So the three founding industries, you might say, were the railroad, the lumbering industry, and the livestock industry. Now, today, you of course see the railroad still busier than ever, sending upwards of 120 freight trains through Flagstaff every day. The ranching industry still exists and still produces mainly beef cattle. Not so the timber industry. You will be very hard-pressed to find any evidence of that once huge and thriving industry here. The ponderosa pine forest, they cut all the best and biggest trees down early on, and as they continued to cut the trees, the big trees, they finally ran out of good trees to cut. And so eventually, in the 1970s, the industry really was out of business. At one time, though, there were three very large lumber mills producing a huge amount of lumber here. And you might look here, we're up against some historical photographs here, one showing a campsite of a group on the way to the Grand Canyon. So tourism to the Grand Canyon is nothing new. It started out as soon as people could get there. But tourism is fundamental to Flagstaff's economy. I mentioned some of the big employers, but far and away the biggest part of our economy is tourism, with all the beautiful national parks and national monuments that we have, Grand Canyon, Sunset Crater, Wupatki, Walnut Canyon. Yeah, tourism is very, very important. And then in the wintertime, of course, the skiers come to enjoy the snow. So really, really big part of the economy. Now, today, of course, a much different story. Flagstaff grew rather slowly during the first, well, almost century of its existence. I think by 1950, the community consisted of somewhere around 7,000 souls. And here we are in 2018, and not counting the 25,000 students at the university, we're approaching 70,000. So it's a very, very fast growth rate, and things are changing very fast. So the major employers now, instead of being those basic industries, are of course the university. W.L. Gore has a major presence here, and of course Flagstaff Medical Center is a very big employer, as are United States Geological Survey and the various government entities, the Coconino County, the city of Flagstaff, and the state government. So it's a much different place today, and I think for some people it's probably growing a little bit too big, too fast, but it's a wonderful place. We're very unique in our weather here. We sit at 7,000 feet. We have a good winter, or we did up until recent years. We average somewhere on the order of 110 inches of snow per year. But it would snow hard and then the sun would come out, and so it was wonderful. In the past few years, things do seem to be changing, and we're in the midst of quite a drought right now, and the winters have not been anything like they were when I was young. So we're all adapting and trying to manage our way through it. But Flagstaff is still a gem, as I hope your viewers will appreciate as they see your program.